Well, hello everyone. Pastor Rich here from Covenant Community Church. This is it's really the third video for the book Andy Stanley, Irresistible. The first video was the introduction, then we covered chapter 1. And so today we're going to be covering chapters 2 through 4. Andy basically just recaps the story of the Old Testament in 3 chapters. And of course, it's not meant to be exhaustive, but he does a good job of summarizing the Old Testament and what happens, and kind of establishing that for what comes next in the book. He talks about a means to an end that God meant for the nation of Israel, and this promise he makes to Abraham to be a means to an end, and that's not a bad thing, right? Being a means to an end is what gives our life meaning, and that's why we have funerals. That's the example he uses. He starts with Abraham, and that God promises to bless Abraham so that then Abraham and his descendants would be a blessing to other nations. This whole idea is that Abraham is blessed so that he might be a blessing to other people and other nations and his descendants. And this calling, this is a covenant God makes with Abraham. And this covenant continues today through the church, through us. Galatians 3:29 reminds us that if you belong to Christ, then you're heirs. You're Abraham's seed, and you are heirs to the promise. That promise that God made to Abraham. So this idea that we are blessed so that we might be a blessing to other people, that started with Abraham very early on in Genesis, and the covenant promise made there, that continues today through us, through the church, through people who claim to be followers of Christ. We are blessed to be a blessing, is what I'm saying. I thought it was interesting when Andy talked about this calling of Abraham, that during this time, during this culture, tribes were about survival and about conquering and plundering and enslaving, and to be a blessing to other nations was outside of anything that had ever been considered. This was survival. This was just trying to make it. And here God calls Abraham and his descendants in this new nation that he's going to establish to look a lot different. And then he moves through all of these stories pretty quickly. He moves on to Moses and the Israelites in Egypt and slavery, and that they are free to demonstrate this God, that God is a God who is both mobile and authoritative. That God, part of God revealing himself through this miracle of freeing the slaves from Egypt is to show his mobility and his authority, that God is not bound to a location. He has the power to go wherever he wants. And this is unique. In that culture, gods were sort of gods of a territory, territorial gods of a locale, of an area. And here, this God, this Israel's God, Yahweh, is saying, I'm everywhere. I'm the God of the whole earth. There's no one place in earth that's my territory. All the earth is my territory. Andy then flies through the 10 Commandments and the golden calf. One point he makes I found interesting is, we wonder, how could they be so tempted to worship a statue? How could the people be so tempted to worship a golden calf, especially after they had seen the miracles that God had done to free them from slavery in Egypt? What would be the appeal to worship a calf? Why did they want that? And just as that, baffles us, they would have thought, how could they not? Like, they need something visible to worship. Andy says it this way: not having an object to worship was as confusing to them as their insistence on having one is to us. It baffles us that they needed one. would baffle them that they don't need one. It was just a cultural thing. He explains the tabernacle. It's basically a portable temple. In the section One Last Thing of chapter 2, he talks about this idea that the covenant that God makes with Israel is in the form of a suzerain treaty, which is an ancient legal document between a suzerain and a vassal, a person in authority and in power sets the rules and conditions of the covenant for someone who has less power. And it's basically, I will as long as you do, right? God says, I'll uphold my end of the bargain if you uphold your end of the bargain. It is conditional. It is a conditional covenant, which means it's a conditional relationship. And this is hard for some of us because when we think of God as a God of unconditional love, and he is a God of unconditional love. But he chooses at this time in history to be in relationship with Israel, with Israel, after the fall. Remember, this is after the fall. And he chooses to be in relationship with Israel through this conditional covenant relationship, which at the time was a form of love. It's not unconditional love being expressed. I think God does still love them unconditionally, but he's relating to them through this covenant because that's the relationship that he's established with them. As long as they do their part, he's going to do their part. You follow this covenant, you follow these laws, and I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. If you don't, then you're going to face the consequences of the covenant, which is judgment, and usually is a type of being conquered by another nation. Usually is what that looked like. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I just want to say the way that I understand part of the purpose of the law, part of the purpose of this conditional covenant, is to frustrate humanity, to frustrate us into realizing who God is, that God is holy and we aren't, and we can't live up to his holiness and his righteousness. We can't live up to his expectations, and it's not a fault of God. It's actually who God is. He is holy and he will never change. So something has to change in the relationship that he has with us, because he can't change and we can't change. We need a Savior who can either help us live up to those expectations or set us free from those expectations. And I think in a way Jesus does both, right? He sets us free from relying on the law to save us. Now it's the work of Jesus Christ on the cross that saves us. And he gives us this resource, the Holy Spirit, to help us live the righteousness that God requires. All right, Israel finally, kind of in the story that Andy paints, find themselves in a land. They make it to the promised land. I feel sorry for Moses. Moses isn't with them. Poor Moses, right? And they call for their own king. They want to look like other nations. They want their own king. God didn't want them to have a king, a human king, because he wanted to be their king. But through Samuel, a prophet Samuel, who's well respected in the community, he says, if you want a king, I'll give you one. But he warns them, it's not going to go well, because this is not what I had in mind for you. And that's how chapter 2 ends. Chapter 3 focuses on the temple. Again, kind of like a king. The temple was not something God wanted or needed. It's something David and then Solomon wanted so that they could be like other nations. For God, it wasn't necessary. On page 41, Andy says that the temple was more beautiful than it was important. And he's a bit tongue-in-cheek here because he says later that the temple does become important, but this is from God's perspective, or I guess it's from people's perspective too, that it's more beautiful than important. It has an important role to play, but it's not important in the sense of knowing who God is or for Israel to follow God. It wasn't important for God for the people to have a temple, but they want one, and God acquiesces through David and Solomon. He just warns them that this isn't like the end, right? This is just another means to an end. This temple, even this temple that you've built for me that's beautiful, is temporary. One thing I found interesting is that what made the Jewish temple unique was not what was there, but what was missing. You know, Andy says that this temple looked a lot like other pagan temples, except for one difference. There was no image, there was no statue for people to see that they could worship. So at least I got that part right. But anyway, God, I think, is constantly trying to remind them that God, He is spirit and He is mobile, right? He's not bound by a location. Andy ends the chapter with Solomon and the destruction of the temple in Judah in 587 BC to the Babylonians. And then chapter 4 focuses on the split, the divided monarchy caused by this. I'm not usually this harsh, but he is an idiot. Rehoboam, one of Solomon's sons, he just makes a dumb decision, and all of a sudden you have a divided nation, divided Israel, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and eventually they're both destroyed. And they're destroyed. First, Israel goes down to the Assyrians in 7 something BC. And then less than 200 years later, Judah falls to the Babylonians. That's that 587 date when the first temple is destroyed. So then Andy talks about the message of the prophets during this time, when God will use Israel, Abraham's descendants. He gives this prophecy that there's going to be a light for Gentiles. It's going to be for all people, all nations. He's going to do something new, right? And of course, these prophecies are referring to Jesus and what Jesus would bring and how Jesus would usher in a new covenant. Between the book of Malachi and the arrival of Jesus, there's 400 years. And within that 400 years, one of the biggest things to happen is what's called the Maccabean Revolt, which was Jewish people trying to get out from under Roman rule. And they failed. These Jewish rebels failed, which led to Roman rule becoming even more oppressive for the Jewish people. And that's the world that Jesus enters into as a young Jewish boy. But he shows up, and I'm assuming Andy will cover some of what that means in the next chapter. Well, he will, in chapter 5. After chapter 5, there's a shift in the book with a new section, and we'll cover what we can there. But next week, we'll cover just chapter 5. So if you got behind because I covered 3 chapters, it's okay. We'll just do chapter 5 next week, and then after that, we'll get into a new section. All right, thanks for joining me. Again, if you have any comments or questions, please post them. I don't know if the YouTube comments are working yet. We're going to try to get them turned on. If not, you can still post questions and comments in Facebook. And I know it's just a link to YouTube, but there's still a place under that link on Facebook to post comments or questions. So please let me know if you have any, and I'll do my best to clarify those. Thanks for joining me. Blessings to everyone. Bye-bye.